The infrared signature appeared at 3:42 hours, a thermal bloom against the Hindu Kush that shouldn't have existed. Captain Rhea Vance watched it from 23,000 feet, her gloved hand steady on the yoke of the MC-130J Commando II as the sensor operator's voice crackled through her headset with controlled confusion. The signature wasn't moving like a vehicle. It wasn't stationary like a structure. It pulsed, faded, then strengthened again in a pattern that made no tactical sense. Intelligence had called the valley empty. 3 satellites and a Reaper drone had confirmed nothing but rock and snow for 6 weeks. Yet there it was, a heat source the size of a school bus, appearing and disappearing in 15-second intervals exactly where 12 Green Berets had gone silent 4 hours earlier. Rhea's co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, leaned forward in his harness, his reflection ghostly in the cockpit glass. "Could be equipment malfunction," he offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Behind them, the cargo bay held 40,000 pounds of medical supplies destined for Bagram, a routine milk run that had suddenly become anything but routine. The C-130 gunship that was supposed to be providing overwatch had diverted to a troops-in-contact situation 70 miles south. The quick reaction force was grounded by weather, and somewhere in that dark valley, call-sign Viper 6 had missed 3 consecutive radio checks. The tactical frequency erupted with static, then a voice so distorted by interference it was barely human. "Any station, Viper 6, coordinates confirmed. They're in the walls." The transmission died. Rhea's jaw tightened as she banked the massive aircraft into a holding pattern, the 4 Rolls-Royce turboprops humming their constant thunder. She'd been flying these mountains for 9 months. Ever since her first deployment ended with a medical discharge she'd fought tooth and nail to reverse. The Air Force had given her a second chance, but they'd also given her the assignments nobody wanted: hauling cargo, flying the overnight logistics runs, the unglamorous work that kept the war machine fed but earned no medals. Now that same disregard might be the only thing between those men and whatever was happening in that valley. Rhea toggled the radio, her voice cutting through the static with the flat professionalism that had become her armor. "Bagram Control, Dust 79er declaring emergency authority. Request immediate ISR support, grid November Papa 4782. We have potential troops in contact, no gunship coverage." The response came back uncertain, bureaucratic. Rhea didn't wait for approval. She'd already pushed the yoke forward, aiming the nose of her 60-ton aircraft toward the darkness below. Nobody had expected her to stay in the fight. Not after what happened in Kandahar. Not after the hearing. Not with a 6-year-old daughter waiting in base housing and a maintenance record that documented every limitation the flight surgeons had placed on her medical waiver. But Rhea Vance had learned long ago that expectations were just another weight you either carried or proved wrong. The altimeter unwound as the C-130 descended, trading the safety of altitude for proximity to whatever was burning in the valley. Her hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of 3,000 flight hours, every switch and dial an extension of her will. Webb's breathing quickened beside her. The loadmaster's voice came through the intercom, tense but controlled, reporting cargo secured for tactical maneuvering. The thermal signature resolved as they dropped below 12,000 feet. Not one heat source, but 7, arranged in a semicircle that was unmistakably defensive. Rhea's mind cataloged the implications in milliseconds. The team had formed a perimeter, which meant they were alive but pinned down. The pulsing pattern wasn't malfunction. It was muzzle flash coordinated fire from multiple positions at a rate that suggested they were being overwhelmed. The valley walls rose like knife edges on either side, a natural corridor barely 300 meters wide at its base. No room for error, no margin for the kind of flying the C-130 was never designed to do. She keyed the radio again, this time on the emergency frequency that would broadcast to anyone listening. "Viper 6, Dust 79er, heavy transport inbound your position. We are not equipped for close air support, but we are the only asset available. Authenticate your position with IR strobe. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then the valley floor erupted with the rapid blink of an infrared beacon, visible only through the night vision equipment that turned the world into shades of green-gray. Ria's eyes found webs in the darkness. He was young, maybe 26, on his second deployment and still impressed by the textbook solutions. This situation wasn't in any textbook. They need suppressing fire, Webb said, stating the obvious. We're not a gunship, Ria replied, her voice level. We're barely cleared for low-altitude formation flying in these conditions. So what do we do? The question hung in the air between them, mixing with the vibration of the engines and the distant crackle of gunfire that was now audible through the hull. Ria had already made her decision, had made it the moment that thermal signature appeared. The same instinct that had kept her alive through 37 combat missions was screaming that conventional doctrine would get those men killed. She needed to think like prey thinks, use size, noise, intimidation, anything but the weapons she didn't possess. The C-130 dropped lower, its shadow racing ahead across moonlit snow. Ria called back to the cargo bay, her voice calm despite the adrenaline turning her blood electric. Loadmaster, prepare to depressurize and open the ramp. I need every external light we have, everything that makes us visible. There was a pause, then a cautious response. Ma'am, that'll make us a target for anything with a rifle. That's the idea, Ria said. If they're shooting at us, they're not shooting at Viper 6. She could feel Webb's stare, sense his doubt mixing with something else, maybe the first glimmer of understanding. The aircraft shuddered as the rear ramp began its hydraulic descent. The cabin pressure equalized with a rush that made their ears pop. Cold mountain air flooded the interior, carrying with it the sharp scent of cordite and burning diesel. The valley narrowed further as Ria committed to the approach, the rock walls so close she could see individual boulders in the landing lights that now blazed from every external mount. The C-130 looked like a flying Christmas tree, every navigation light, every taxi light, every emergency beacon activated simultaneously. It was the opposite of tactical flying, a violation of every stealth principle that had kept cargo aircraft alive in hostile territory. It was also working. The muzzle flashes below shifted, some turning away from the green beret position to track this new, impossible target. A 60-ton transport aircraft thundering through a mountain valley at 300 feet, lit up like a Vegas casino, and trailing an open ramp that looked like the mouth of a cave. Ria held the aircraft steady, fighting the turbulence that tried to slam them into the cliff faces. Her right hand danced across the throttles, adjusting power to each engine independently, using the asymmetric thrust to keep them centered in the corridor. This wasn't flying. It was controlled falling with style, a high-wire act performed in 4 dimensions with 12 lives depending on her not flinching. The radio exploded with voices, all speaking at once, Bagram Control demanding her intentions, the Air Operations Center trying to recall her, and underneath it all a new voice, rough and desperate, Viper 6 Actual Master Sergeant David Cowery, his words coming in gasps between what sounded like controlled breathing and suppressing fire. Dust 7-9er, you magnificent crazy. We've got egress. Moving to exfil point. Need 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Ria counted them in her heartbeat as she pulled the C-130 into a banking turn that made the wings groan and the load straps in the cargo bay sing with tension. The hostile fire had shifted almost entirely to tracking the aircraft now, green tracers rising like angry fireflies to chase her tail. Most fell short, the shooters unaccustomed to judging speed and distance against something this large. Most, but not all. Something pinged off the fuselage, a metallic shriek that made Webb flinch. Receiving fire, he reported, his voice tight. Maintain pattern, Ria commanded, her hand steady even as another round stitched across the left wing, punching through aluminum but missing anything critical. The C-130 was built for this, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, a trait she shared with the aircraft in ways that went beyond the technical. She'd taken hits before, different kind, different context, but the principle was the same. You didn't stop. You didn't quit. You found a way to finish the mission even when the mission had changed into something nobody briefed. The altimeter showed 250 feet, too low for the terrain. She pulled up, trading speed for altitude, then pushed back down as the valley opened slightly. A deadly rhythm, rising and falling like a boxer bobbing and weaving, staying in the pocket where the enemy could see her but couldn't quite hit anything vital. Viper 6 is clear of the kill zone, Cowrie's voice came through, stronger now. Moving to grid November Papa 4791. We have 2 urgent surgical, 4 ambulatory wounded. Ria's mind shifted gears instantly. The mission had evolved again from distraction to extraction. She keyed the radio, addressing the loadmaster. Prepare the bay for emergency casualty recovery. We're going to need every secured position we have. The loadmaster's response was professional despite the impossibility of what she was suggesting. Ma'am, we have no defensive approach to that grid. It's a hot LZ with no security element. Then we make it cold, Ria said, and banked the aircraft toward the new coordinates, already calculating angles and approach vectors that would let a cargo plane do the work of a combat rescue helicopter. The valley had other ideas. As the C-130 turned, the terrain collapsed into a box canyon, the walls rising on 3 sides like an amphitheater designed by a malevolent god. The only way out was the way she'd come in, now blocked by the same hostile forces that had pinned down Viper 6. Ria saw it all in an instant. The trap, the geometry, the mistake of assuming this would be simple. Webb saw it too, his hand instinctively moving toward the emergency power levers. We need to climb out now, he said, urgency bleeding through his training. Ria shook her head, her eyes tracking the infrared strobes that marked the green berace position at the far end of the canyon. Can't climb fast enough with a full load. We'd be a target for 3 miles. Then what? Webb's question was the same one being asked in half a dozen operations centers across 3 continents as satellite feeds showed a cargo aircraft doing things cargo aircraft simply didn't do. Ria's answer came not in words but in action. She pushed the throttles to maximum continuous power and dove the aircraft toward the canyon floor, accelerating to a speed that made the airframe shudder and the overspeed warning start its insistent beeping. The rock walls blurred past the cockpit windows, close enough to see cracks and snow. She was heading directly toward the sheer cliff face that marked the canyon's end, the one physical feature that couldn't be negotiated or intimidated. Webb's hand gripped the armrest, his training warring with his survival instinct. The cliff face grew larger, filling the windscreen. At the last possible moment, Ria pulled back on the yoke with both hands, hauling the C-130 into a climb so steep the wings should have stalled. The aircraft groaned, metal protesting forces it was never meant to endure. The stall warning blared. The stick shaker activated, buzzing against her palms. And then they were over the ridge, the belly of the aircraft clearing the cliff face by less than 40 feet, so close that snow blown up by the prop wash obscured the windows for a heartbeat. Webb released a breath he didn't know he was holding. Behind them, the hostile forces were now cut off by the same terrain feature Ria had used to escape, their line of sight broken by the ridge. The green berets were still trapped, but now they had breathing room, a precious few minutes to consolidate and prepare for extraction. Ria brought the aircraft around in a wide arc, gaining altitude and distance, using the mountain peaks for cover. Her voice was steady as she contacted Bagram Control again, no longer requesting but informing. Dust 79er is executing emergency combat recovery, grid November Papa 4791. Clear all airspace within 5 miles. We're coming in hot. The operations center erupted in protest, voices overlapping with regulations and procedures, and the chain of command that Ria was currently ignoring with extreme prejudice. She recognized one voice, Colonel Frank Morrison, the operations group commander who'd reluctantly approved her return to flight status after Kandahar. His tone was clipped, angry, but underneath she heard something else. Concern, maybe, or fear that he'd be explaining her actions to the general. Captain Vance, you are ordered to abort and return to base. That is a direct order. Ria's finger hovered over the transmit button. In 9 years of service, she'd never disobeyed a direct order. The consequences were clear, court-martial, end of career, loss of the wings she'd fought so hard to keep. But she'd also never left anyone behind, never turned away from the sound of someone calling for help. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Unable to comply, she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything that statement meant. There are friendlies in contact. I have the only airframe in range. Unless you're offering me an alternative, Dust 79er is continuing the approach. The radio went silent, Morrison either accepting her logic or coordinating her arrest. It didn't matter. Rhea was already lining up the final approach, using the ridge line for concealment until the last possible moment. The Green Berets had marked their position with a crude landing zone, 4 IR strobes arranged in an H pattern on a shelf of rock barely large enough for the C-130's wingspan. It wasn't a proper landing zone. It was a suggestion of flat ground, surrounded by obstacles and hostile territory, the kind of place where cargo aircraft went to die. Webb was staring at it through the night vision, his face pale green in the display. "That can't be more than 800 feet, he said. "The manual says we need at least 1,500 for a tactical landing." "The manual doesn't account for desperation," Rhea replied, already configuring the aircraft for the approach, flaps full, props max RPM, landing lights off to preserve night vision. She flew the approach by feel as much as instruments, the aircraft descending through layers of turbulence that made the controls feel sluggish. The rock shelf appeared in the windscreen, impossibly small, impossibly surrounded by terrain that could shred the wings in a heartbeat of inattention. Rhea's world narrowed to 3 things: airspeed, altitude, and the aim point her mind had calculated. Everything else, the radio chatter, the hostile forces reforming below, the daughter waiting in Colorado Springs for a mother who might not come home, all of it compressed into a singularity of focus that left no room for doubt. The wheels touched down hard, the landing gear absorbing the impact with a metallic shriek. Rhea stood on the brakes, feeling them grab, feeling the aircraft slow, but knowing it wasn't enough. They were going to overshoot the shelf, going to tumble over the edge into the canyon below. Without conscious thought, she reversed the props on the outboard engines while keeping the inboards pushing forward, a technique she'd read about in a manual from the Vietnam War but never practiced. The asymmetric thrust fought itself, the aircraft skewing sideways, the left wing dropping toward the rocks. For 3 eternal seconds, physics and will battled for supremacy. Then the C-130 shuddered to a stop, the nose wheel hanging over the edge of the shelf, the wings level, every system still functioning. The loadmaster's voice came through the intercom, shaky but professional. "We're down. Ramp is open. I see personnel approaching." Rhea's hands wouldn't release the controls, her muscles locked from the sustained tension. Webb was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, shock, awe, maybe the beginning of respect. Outside, shadows moved through the darkness, 12 figures in full combat kit moving with the controlled urgency of men who just survived the impossible. Master Sergeant Cowery was first up the ramp, blood on his uniform, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He met Rhea's eyes through the open cockpit door, and in that moment, no words were needed. The loading happened in controlled chaos, the Green Berets carrying their wounded with practiced gentleness while the loadmaster directed them to secured positions. Rhea's eyes tracked the elapsed time on her mission clock. They'd been on the ground for 93 seconds. Every additional second increased the odds of incoming fire, of the enemy realizing where they'd landed and adjusting their aim. At 2 minutes, Cowery appeared in the cockpit doorway, his hand slapping the bulkhead twice. "All personnel aboard. Get us out of here." Rhea didn't need to be told twice. The takeoff was even more violent than the landing, the aircraft clawing its way off the shelf with meters to spare, the wings flexing as she put them into an aggressive climb that pushed the engines to the edge of their red line. Tracer fire followed them up, angry green lines that fell away as the C-130 climbed beyond the effective range of small arms. Only when they'd reached 12,000 feet and turned toward Bagram did Rhea allow herself to exhale. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her nervous system. Webb was conducting the post-flight checks with mechanical precision, his voice steady despite everything they'd just done. Behind them, the loadmaster was triaging the wounded, his medical training taking over from his flight duties. Two of the Green Berets were unconscious, their teammates holding pressure on wounds that would need a surgeon's skill within the hour. The others sat in silence, their weapons still ready, their eyes still scanning for threats even though the immediate danger had passed. Rhea engaged the autopilot and slumped back in her seat, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. Her vision swam for a moment, fatigue and stress combining into something that felt like drowning. Webb noticed, his hand moving toward the controls, ready to take over. She waved him off, forcing her eyes to focus, her breathing to steady. The aircraft still needed her. The mission wasn't over until everyone was safe on the ground at Bagram, and that was still 43 minutes of flying through airspace that had suddenly become very interested in her exact location. The radio had been ominously quiet since they'd lifted off, none of the usual traffic control chatter or mission updates. Now it crackled to life, Morrison's voice tight with controlled fury. "Dust 79er, you are to proceed directly to Bagram and report to my office immediately upon landing. Do you copy?" "Roger that," Rhea replied, too tired to care about the impending reckoning. She'd saved 12 men. Whatever consequences followed, she could live with them. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of autopilot heading changes and checklist items. Bagram's runway lights appeared on the horizon, a string of white pearls in the darkness that represented safety, debriefing, and probably the end of her career. She didn't care. The landing was textbook, the aircraft settling onto the runway with the gentleness of a mother laying down her child. Medical personnel swarmed the moment she shut down the engines, taking custody of the wounded with efficient precision. Rhea sat in the darkened cockpit long after the engine stopped spinning, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Webb had already climbed out, following procedure by staying with the aircraft during the medical evacuation. Through the windscreen, she watched the Green Berets being loaded into ambulances, their teammates refusing to leave their sides. Cowery was the last to go, pausing at the edge of the ramp to look back at the C-130 that had become his salvation. Even at this distance, Rhea saw him raise his hand in a salute that felt more like a prayer. She returned it, her throat tight with emotions she'd learned to bury. The walk to Morrison's office took longer than the entire mission, her flight suit heavy with sweat and fear and the smell of hydraulic fluid. The hallways were empty at this hour, just fluorescent lights and the distant hum of generators keeping the base alive. Outside the colonel's door, she paused to square her shoulders, to prepare for the professional execution that was surely coming. Morrison was waiting behind his desk, his face carved from granite. But he wasn't alone. 3 other officers filled the small office, a JAG attorney, a flight safety investigator, and someone Rhea didn't recognize wearing a special operations tab. The tribunal was already assembled. Morrison gestured to the single empty chair. "Sit down, Captain Vance." She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The colonel opened a folder, his eyes scanning pages that Rhea knew contained every rule she'd broken, every procedure she'd ignored, every moment of her unauthorized combat rescue mission. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "That was the most reckless, dangerous, unauthorized piece of flying I've seen in 28 years of service," he said, his voice flat. Rhea said nothing. There was nothing to say. "It was also," Morrison continued, and now something cracked in his professional facade, "the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. Those men are alive because you refused to accept the limitations we placed on you." The room shifted, the energy changing from accusatory to something else. The special operations officer leaned forward, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. "Master Sergeant Cowery and his team have already submitted statements. They're unanimous. You saved their lives when no one else was willing to try. That means something in our community." The JAG attorney cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "Technically, Captain Vance violated several articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. However, given the circumstances and the outcome, the recommendation is for administrative counseling rather than court-martial." Ria's mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Not punishment but recognition. Not the end but maybe a beginning. Morrison stood, walking around the desk to face her directly. "Your call sign," he said. "I know you never chose one, said you didn't need the distraction. But the loadmaster who flew with you tonight, he's been telling anyone who'll listen about the shepherd who watched over that valley." Shepherd. The word hit her harder than expected, carrying weight beyond its letters. "The men you saved tonight, they're calling you that too," Morrison continued. "Says you didn't herd them, you led them out, protected them when no one else could." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ria took it. "Welcome back to the fight, Shepherd. Try not to give me a heart attack next time." She left the office in a daze, the reprimand that wasn't really a reprimand tucked under her arm, the call sign that wasn't really her settling onto her shoulders like a mantle. The sky was lightening in the east, turning the mountains gold and pink. Ria stood on the flight line, watching the C-130 being towed to maintenance, its skin marked with bullet holes and stress fractures and the evidence of an impossible night. A voice spoke behind her, Cowery, discharged from medical with nothing more serious than exhaustion and minor shrapnel wounds. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "before the bureaucracy makes it weird." Ria turned to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time without the green wash of night vision or the chaos of combat. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, with gray threading his beard and scars that told stories he'd probably never share. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I was just doing my job." "No," Cowery corrected gently. "Your job was to haul supplies from point A to point B. What you did tonight, that was something else. That was choosing to be there when it mattered, regardless of the cost." They stood in silence as the sun rose higher, turning the flight line into a landscape of shadows and light. Finally, Cowery spoke again, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from survival. "My team operates in a lot of bad places. It helps knowing there are people like you in the air, people who won't leave us behind." He left without waiting for a response, rejoining his team for the long flight back to their forward operating base. Ria watched him go, then turned her attention back to the damaged C-130. Maintenance crews were swarming over it now, cataloging every hit, every stress point, every place where physics and will had intersected with violence. The aircraft would fly again, eventually, after repairs and inspections and the slow bureaucracy of military logistics. In the meantime, she had reports to file, briefings to attend, and a video call to make to a 6-year-old daughter who deserved to know that mommy was safe. The story of that night spread faster than official channels could contain it. By noon, every pilot on the base had heard about the C-130 that had flown like a fighter jet through a mountain valley, about the captain who'd ignored direct orders to save a team that everyone else had written off. Some of the stories were accurate. Some were embellished. All of them missed the fundamental truth. Ria Vance hadn't done anything heroic. She'd simply refused to accept the alternative. In the days that followed, her life settled into a new normal. The same missions, the same routes, the same cargo holds filled with supplies that kept the war machine functioning. But something had changed, subtle but undeniable. The mockery that had followed her medical waiver, the whispered doubts about whether she could still handle the pressure, all of it evaporated like morning mist. Pilots nodded to her in the hallways. Ground crews went the extra mile on her pre-flights. And on the tactical frequencies, when she checked in with her call sign, the response carried a weight of respect that hadn't been there before. Shepherd became more than a name. It became a promise that someone was watching, that help would come, that the impossible was just the starting point for what needed to be done. Ria wore it uncomfortably at first, unused to being seen as anything other than competent but expendable. The attention felt wrong, like praise for doing what anyone would have done. But as weeks turned into months, she began to understand what the call sign really meant. It wasn't about her individual actions that night. It was about the principle she demonstrated, that some situations required breaking the rules, that sometimes the mission wasn't what you were assigned, but what you chose to accept. Other pilots began seeking her out for advice, asking about decision-making under pressure, about how to navigate the gap between doctrine and necessity. She deflected most of it, uncomfortable with the role of mentor. But occasionally, usually late at night in the operations center when the base was quiet, she'd share the real lesson. Trust your instincts, know your aircraft's limits, and never assume someone else will do what you're capable of doing yourself. 6 months after the Valley, Rhea found herself sitting in a briefing room with 24 special operations personnel, presenting tactics for emergency cargo extraction from hostile zones. It was surreal, being asked to teach concepts she'd learned through desperation rather than study. The presentation went well enough, her practical experience translating into doctrine that could be taught and repeated. Afterward, a green beret she didn't recognize approached, his handshake firm. "My team was scheduled for that Valley insertion," he said. "We got weathered out, so Viper 6 went instead. Could have been us you pulled out. Wanted you to know that matters, not just to Cowery's guys, but to everyone who operates out there." The comment stayed with her through the evening, through the routine of post-flight checks and the paperwork that governed military aviation. One mission, one night, one choice made under pressure, and suddenly she'd become a touchstone for an entire community. It was humbling and terrifying in equal measure, the weight of expectations from people who depended on her continuing to be the pilot who didn't flinch. She called her daughter that night, the video connection spotty but functional. Emma was learning multiplication tables, struggling with the same math that had once frustrated Rhea. "Sometimes it feels too hard, Mom," Emma said, her 6-year-old face scrunched with concentration. "Like I can't do it no matter how hard I try." Rhea smiled, recognizing the feeling. "Those are the problems worth solving," she said. "The easy ones don't teach you anything. It's the ones that seem impossible that show you what you're really capable of." Emma considered this, her expression serious beyond her years. "Like you're flying." "Exactly like that," Rhea confirmed and meant it. The following month brought a new challenge, a tasking order for a humanitarian mission into a region where government forces and insurgents had fought to a bloody stalemate. The mission profile called for low-altitude supply drops to villages cut off by fighting, a dangerous evolution that put cargo aircraft in the envelope where they were most vulnerable. Most crews would have flown it by the book, maintaining altitude until the last moment, dropping the cargo from as high as doctrine allowed. Rhea studied the terrain maps and talked to the ground controllers, understanding quickly that the standard approach would result in supplies scattered across miles of contested territory. To get the accuracy needed, she'd have to fly lower, slower, more exposed than any reasonable risk assessment would recommend. Her crew didn't question when she briefed the modified approach. They'd learned to trust her judgment, to understand that when Shepard calculated risk, she factored in things the manuals couldn't quantify. The mission went perfectly, supplies hitting their marks with precision that drew praise from the village elders and confusion from the operations center. How had she achieved that accuracy? The answer was simple but difficult to replicate. She'd cared more about the outcome than her own safety, had been willing to put the aircraft exactly where it needed to be regardless of the danger. That principle became her signature, the thing that separated her flying from the merely competent. Other pilots could match her technical skills, could fly the procedures as smoothly. But when situations evolved beyond the planned parameters, when the mission required adapting rather than aborting, Rhea Vance found solutions that others missed because she was willing to accept risks that others considered unreasonable. The Air Force began to notice. Assignments came down that were tagged specifically for her, missions that needed both technical proficiency and creative problem-solving. Evacuating civilians from a collapsing government compound, delivering emergency medical supplies through a sandstorm that had grounded every other aircraft, recovering a downed pilot from terrain that helicopters couldn't reach. Each mission added another story to the legend, another example of the cargo pilot who refused to let circumstances dictate outcomes. And with each mission, the weight of expectation grew heavier. Rhea felt it in the way commanders briefed her, assuming success before she'd even reviewed the mission parameters. She felt it in the eyes of younger pilots who saw her as proof that women could excel in combat aviation, that medical waivers didn't mean limitations, that single mothers could be just as dedicated as anyone else. The pressure should have been crushing. Instead, it became fuel. Every time someone assumed she'd find a way, she found a way. Every time the mission seemed impossible, she remembered that night in the valley when impossible had just been the starting point. The anniversary of the rescue found her back at Bagram, scheduled for a routine supply run to one of the forward operating bases. She'd requested the mission specifically, wanting to overfly the valley where it had all changed. The flight was smooth, the weather clear, the mission accomplished without incident. But as she passed over those familiar mountains, Rhea found herself thinking about paths not taken. What if she'd followed orders that night? What if she'd accepted the limitations others had placed on her, flown back to base, let someone else handle the crisis? 12 men would be dead, certainly. Her career would have continued along its predictable arc, competent but unremarkable, and she'd be haunted forever by the knowledge that she'd chosen safety over service, procedure over principle. The thought was unbearable. As the C-130 banked toward home, Rhea caught her reflection in the cockpit glass. Older than the woman who'd started this deployment, marked by responsibility and expectation, but somehow more complete. The pilot who'd fought so hard to return to flight status had proven that the fight was worthwhile, that second chances were meant to be seized with both hands and refused to be wasted. Back at Bagram, she found a package waiting in her quarters, no return address, just her name and rank stenciled on the box. Inside was a unit patch from Viper 6, their team insignia embroidered with precision. But this patch was different. Stitched along the bottom in letters that caught the light was a single word, Shepherd. A note accompanied it, handwritten in block letters. For the pilot who made impossible look routine, you earned this. Every man you saved that night has won, so should you. Viper 6. Rhea held the patch, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. Not just gratitude from one team, but acceptance into a community that valued action over credentials, that judged people by what they did when everything was on the line. She'd spent years trying to prove she belonged, fighting against perceptions and policies and her own self-doubt. This patch, offered freely by men whose respect couldn't be manufactured or assigned, meant more than any medal or commendation. She sewed it onto her flight suit that night, the needlework careful and deliberate, each stitch a commitment to maintaining the standard she'd set for herself. The deployment ended eventually, as all deployments do. Rhea returned to the United States, to a daughter who'd grown 3 inches and a base that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. The transition was jarring, going from the constant operational tempo of Afghanistan to the routine of stateside flying. Training missions, proficiency checks, the endless cycle of maintaining readiness for conflicts that might or might not come. Other pilots returning from deployment struggled with the adjustment, missing the intensity and purpose of combat operations. Rhea felt it too, but differently. She'd brought the valley home with her, carried it in the way she approached every mission, every decision, every moment when someone needed more than the minimum. The maintenance crews noticed it first, how she walked the aircraft before every flight, running her hands along the fuselage like checking a beloved horse for injuries. How she knew every system intimately, could diagnose problems by sound or feel that others needed instruments to identify. The C-130 wasn't just her aircraft, it was her partner, the tool that allowed her to accomplish missions that seemed impossible, and she treated it with the respect that partnership demanded. Young pilots began requesting to fly with her, seeing rides with Shepherd as valuable training that couldn't be replicated in simulators. Rhea accepted some of the requests, turning each flight into a lesson in judgment under pressure. She didn't lecture or preach. She simply demonstrated, making decisions in real time and explaining her reasoning afterward. How to read whether that wasn't quite what the forecast predicted. How to feel when an aircraft was approaching its limits. How to communicate with air traffic control when you needed flexibility, but couldn't explicitly ask for rule breaking. Most importantly, she taught them to trust themselves, to understand that regulations existed for good reasons but weren't always sufficient for every situation. Know the rules so well you understand when to break them, she'd say. And when you break them, make sure it's for something that matters. The Air Force eventually caught up with her reputation, assigning her to a test program for enhanced cargo capabilities in contested environments. The role put her at the intersection of tactics development and practical application, flying experimental approaches and providing feedback to the engineers who were trying to codify her instincts into doctrine. It was fascinating work, translating gut feelings into procedures that other pilots could execute. But it also felt like capturing lightning. Some things defied standardization, required judgment that came from experience rather than training. She said as much in one particularly contentious meeting with program managers who wanted definitive procedures for every conceivable scenario. You can't checklist your way through chaos, Rhea argued, her voice level but firm. These tactics work because the pilot makes decisions based on the specific circumstances, not because they're following a script. The program manager, a lieutenant colonel who'd spent more time in offices than cockpits, frowned. We need reproducible results. If it only works when you're flying, it's not a tactic, it's a personality trait. The comment stung, hitting close to her deepest fear, that what she'd accomplished was somehow unique to her, impossible for others to replicate. But Master Sergeant Cowery, present as a special operations liaison, spoke up before she could respond. With respect, sir, that's exactly what we need. Pilots who can adapt, who don't lock up when the script doesn't match reality. Shepard here, she's not special because of some magic touch. She's special because she's willing to make hard calls and live with the consequences. That can be taught. The meeting ended without resolution, but Cowery's words stayed with Rhea. Maybe he was right. Maybe what she'd learned in that valley wasn't about flying skill, but about accepting responsibility, about refusing to hide behind procedure when people needed more. Years passed, each one adding depth to the legacy that had started with one night, one choice, one refusal to accept limitations. Rhea made captain, then major, her career trajectory adjusted by a mixture of skill and the kind of reputation that opened doors most officers never knew existed. She flew fewer missions as rank increased, spending more time planning operations than executing them. It was the natural progression of military careers, but she felt the loss of the cockpit like a physical ache. Command offered different satisfactions. Watching pilots she trained successfully complete difficult missions, knowing her influence extended beyond her individual sorties. But it also meant more distance from the work that defined her, more layers of bureaucracy between intention and action. She accepted it because the alternative was leaving entirely, giving up the wings she'd fought so hard to keep. Then came the call that would define the final act of her career. A civilian airliner had been hijacked mid-flight, forced to land at a remote airfield in a region where U.S. forces had limited reach. The passengers included 3 American citizens. Standard protocol called for diplomatic negotiation, waiting for the State Department and FBI to coordinate a response that could take days. But intelligence indicated the hijackers were planning to execute hostages within hours, creating a timeline that couldn't be met through conventional channels. The Secretary of Defense convened a crisis meeting, attended by a who of military and intelligence leadership. The problem was straightforward. They needed to get Special Operations Forces to the airfield fast, before the hijackers made good on their threats. But the airfield was surrounded by hostile territory, too far for helicopters and too dangerous for conventional infiltration. Someone suggested a halo jump from 30,000 feet, special operators parachuting from a cargo aircraft and infiltrating on foot. It could work, but it would take hours they didn't have. Colonel Morrison, now a general and in charge of air operations, leaned back in his chair. "What if we don't infiltrate?" he said quietly. "What if we land, let the operators breach directly from the aircraft, and extract while the hijackers are still trying to figure out what happened. The room erupted in objections. Landing a U.S. military aircraft at a hostile airfield was tantamount to an act of war. Even if they could do it, the approach would be obvious, giving the hijackers time to execute hostages. The plan was impossible on multiple levels, violating both military doctrine and international law. Morrison let them talk, then raised his hand for silence. "I know a pilot who specializes in impossible," he said. "Someone who's proven that with the right person flying, the aircraft becomes something more than the sum of its technical specifications." He looked directly at the screen where remote participants were connected. "Major Vance, this is a volunteer mission only. High risk, limited support, and quite possibly the last thing you'll ever fly if it goes wrong. Are you interested?" Rhea, attending from her base 500 miles away, didn't hesitate. "Send me the details." The plan came together with the desperate creativity of people who understood there were no good options, only gradations of bad ones. A MC-130J, modified for special operations, flown by Rhea with a crew of volunteers and carrying a hostage rescue team of 12 operators. They'd approach at night, using terrain masking to stay below radar, then execute an assault landing, touching down with enough speed to cover the distance quickly, but slow enough to let the operators deploy without breaking ankles. The window would be measured in seconds. Any longer and the hijackers would respond. Any shorter and the operators couldn't breach effectively. Everything depended on precision that existed only in theory, on a pilot's ability to put a 60-ton aircraft exactly where it needed to be at exactly the right speed, in darkness, with no room for error. The briefing lasted 4 hours, covering every contingency they could imagine and acknowledging the dozens they couldn't. The operators were professional and calm, men who'd executed similar raids from helicopters but never from a cargo plane. Their team leader, a captain named Rodriguez, studied the aircraft specifications with the intensity of someone whose life depended on understanding the tools. "Can this really work?" he asked Rhea during a break, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Rhea considered the question seriously, knowing he deserved honesty. "I can put you on the ground where you need to be when you need to be there. The rest depends on your team and a lot of luck." Rodriguez nodded, accepting the assessment. "They say you're the best at this kind of thing, flying where others won't." "They say a lot of things," Rhea replied. "Doesn't make them all true." "No," Rodriguez agreed. "But the men from that valley, they don't exaggerate. Cowery told me you'd either get us killed or save the day. No middle ground with Shepard." The comment made Rhea smile despite the tension. "Let's aim for option 2. The flight launched at sunset, the MC-130J lifting off from a base whose name would never appear in any official record. The crew was silent during the climb out, each person locked in their own mental preparation. Rhea flew manually, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs, reacquainting herself with the specific handling characteristics that made this particular C-130 different from the others she'd flown. 6 hours to the target area. 6 hours to think about everything that could go wrong, about the daughter who'd be devastated if her mother didn't come home, about the hostages whose lives depended on decisions measured in fractions of seconds. Webb was her co-pilot again, now a captain himself and fully invested in the mission. They didn't talk much during the cruise, both conserving energy for the approach that would demand everything they had. As they crossed into hostile airspace, Rhea felt the familiar narrowing of focus, the world compressing into instruments and objectives. The Special Operations team was assembled in the cargo bay, their equipment checked and rechecked, their minds running through the assault plan that had been drilled into them during the abbreviated training. Rodriguez stood near the cockpit door, monitoring progress, his expression revealing nothing but professional calm. 30 minutes, Rhea announced over the intercom. The operators shifted, making final adjustments, becoming the human weapons they'd trained to be. The terrain rose to meet them as Rhea descended, using mountains for cover, keeping the aircraft low enough to avoid radar but high enough to clear the peaks. The flying was technical and demanding, every control input deliberate, every adjustment calculated. Webb handled the radios and navigation, feeding her information without cluttering the frequency, their partnership refined by years of flying together. 10 minutes, Rhea called. The operators stood, hooking their safety lines, preparing for the controlled violence that was coming. The airfield appeared in the distance, a small strip carved into a valley, lit by perimeter lights that made it visible but not exactly welcoming. Intelligence had identified the hijacked airliner, parked at the far end of the runway, surrounded by vehicles. Through the advanced optics mounted on the C-130J, they could see heat signatures, hostages in the aircraft, hijackers moving around the perimeter, a situation seconds away from turning deadly. 2 minutes, Rhea announced, beginning the approach that would make or break everything. She'd planned the final leg obsessively, calculating angles and speeds that existed only in her mind. The approach would be steep and fast, using the terrain to shield them until the last moment, then flaring hard to bleed off speed and touch down with the operators already moving. The margin for error was non-existent. Too fast and the operators would break bones deploying. Too slow and the hijackers would have time to respond, to execute hostages, to turn this rescue into a bloodbath. Rhea's hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of 1,500 hours in type. Power back, flaps extended, gear down. The C-130J descended like a controlled avalanche, the mountain peaks falling away as they committed to the approach. The hijackers never saw them coming. The aircraft materialized out of the darkness, its engines at flight idle to reduce noise, its lights extinguished until the last moment. Rhea felt the main wheels touch, felt the aircraft settle, and pulled the throttles to reverse even as her right hand was already reaching for the button that would drop the rear ramp. Go, 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 Rodriguez's voice barked over the intercom, and then the operators were flooding out of the aircraft, their movements precise and lethal. The gunfire started before they'd even fully deployed, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of door-breaching charges. Rhea kept her feet on the brakes, holding the aircraft stationary even though every instinct screamed to advance the throttles and get airborne. The operators needed this stable platform, needed to know exactly where their exfiltration point would be. She watched through the cockpit windows as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, as the assault team moved with the synchronized violence that special operations had perfected. It was impossible to follow the action, impossible to know if the plan was succeeding or collapsing. All she could do was wait, trust, and be ready. Hostages secured, Rodriguez's voice came through, triumphant but strained. Beginning exfil 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds stretched like hours. Rhea's eyes tracked the operators returning, some carrying passengers who couldn't run, all moving with urgency that suggested the situation remained fluid. The ramp was still down, the cargo bay a pool of light in the darkness. She counted heads as they boarded, operators first, then civilians, then more operators providing rear guard. The loadmaster's voice was steady. All personnel aboard, ramp closing. Rhea didn't wait for the ramp to fully cycle. As soon as the loadmaster confirmed seal, she released the brakes and advanced the throttles, feeling the aircraft surge forward. The runway was barely adequate for a normal takeoff. With the weight of passengers and the need to climb quickly out of hostile territory, it was going to be marginal. The end of the runway rushed toward them, the darkness beyond promising either sky or oblivion. Rhea pulled back on the yoke at the last possible moment, feeling the nose wheel lift, feeling the main gear follow, feeling the aircraft claw its way into the air with meters to spare. They were airborne, climbing, alive. The cargo bay erupted in cheers that made it to the cockpit, the sound of survivors who just beaten death by the thinnest margin.